Welcome. This is Spiritual Formation, an invitation to drawing near. This is a podcast about Christian spiritual formation that is a word-centered, spirit-empowered, whole-life spirituality. I am your host, Kyle Strobel. Thank you for listening to this next invitation to a deeper life with God.
Well, hello, everyone. I hope you are well. It is always good to be with you. You know, as of late, we've been working through some of the questions that I've been wrestling through I've been teaching spiritual formation at a seminary level now for over a decade, and I've been writing in this area for, 15, 20 years. And so as of late, I've kind of felt like I really need to go back now and begin to think through, well, what is the proper language and even categories we need to use to think well about this. So the discontinuity continuity category is something I've thought of recently as, this might be a helpful way to frame kind of what are we even talking about here, or what's going on, or how should we approach these questions? And so if you remember, discontinuity and continuity, what that distinction does for us is it approaches not on a level of communication, because on a level of communication, we have to pick and choose our battles, right? It's depending on our audience, depending who we're talking to, depending on our context and why, and all sorts of things. But when it comes to the kind of shaping of our minds and imaginations, I think it's important to begin with discontinuity, and discontinuity refers to how we are formed. So someone that begins with discontinuity isn't going to start with, well, how are people just formed in the natural world? Now, importantly, I'm going to have to do that. And you see, this is what, I worry that I could imagine a case, I should say, that someone hears this and says, yes, I think this is right, but then fails to do the work of continuity. Well, again, that's going to be a failure in my mind. Remember, continuity is going to say, well, look, there's natural formation and there's supernatural formation, and those are going to be analogous. The danger of continuity will be to allow the kind of discussion of nature to establish everything necessary, and they're just going to kind of tweak it slightly for spiritual formation. And so what becomes discontinuous is minor, and I think it's major. And one of the reasons I think it's major is simply I just think Scripture talks this way. I don't know how else to read Galatians 2:20, right? It is no longer I who live, but Christ in me. I don't know how to think about the fact of having the mind of Christ or my life being hidden with Christ in God. There are these features of the Scriptures, of Jesus's teaching, of course, right? The last are first, first to last. If you try to save your life, you must lose it. But if you lose it, you can save it, right? Like all of these things point to a radical discontinuity with nature as we know it. And so when we think about spiritual formation and we think about our own articulation of this formation, again, I'm particularly worried about how this happens. Obviously in spiritual formation books and things, which I think have been dominated by the opposite proposal. Now, again, some of that might be more based on the choice of communication, right? So it could be that. I actually don't think that's the case. I think most that I see allow the kind of continuity thesis, the analogy between nature and supernature. They allow that the kind of natural formation to determine the rules of the game, as it were. So much so that at the end of the day, their account of spiritual formation is entirely naturalistic, and there's something tacked on the end that makes it supernatural. Oftentimes, it's just something like the Spirit's power makes it work. In many cases, it sounds just like magic, actually. It's like, well, you say the right words, or you do liturgy in this way, and if it's the right kinds of liturgy, then boom, you're formed. And there's going to be all sorts of problems with that, other than the obvious sense that it's clearly false. I mean, there's plenty of churches who have gorgeous liturgies that are spiritual disasters. So we have to have some kind of account that recognizes this. And so I wanted to do something today. I actually wasn't going to do this. I'm going to turn my attention, I think, next time to a little bit of a meta reflection on what is needed now in the spiritual formation conversation. But I'm going to push that off because I realize it might be helpful to talk about a kind of conversation. I'm not going to get into the details of the academic discussion, but there is an important discussion here that is often simply referred to as nature and grace. And there's often there's often wide agreement that grace perfects nature, even though, and that's true among Protestants as well as Catholics, even though almost every Catholic I ever read that talks about this makes a point to saying that Protestants don't get this, and that's just simply false in the tradition. There's legions of examples of Protestants just saying that explicitly, whether it's kind of someone like Jonathan Edwards or John Owen or Herman Bavinck or whoever, right? And so grace perfects nature. And basically what that's getting at has to do with the fall. And so I just want to consider this because this is going to be part of our kind of mental architecture. And if we don't attend to this, we're likely to make one of two errors. So what's the problem with the fall theologically? Well, and by that I mean kind of what sort of errors can we make when we talk about sin's entrance into creation? And how might that negatively impact our vision of spiritual formation? When we talk about the fall, we're always talking about creation, and we're always talking about sin and brokenness entering into creation. And two errors are often made here. Again, holding these in balance and kind of navigating the tensions between these is going to be fundamental. And yet, again, it's so easy to make one of these errors. So the first error is going to be to have such a significant account of sin that we forget that humankind and all of creation was created good. Notice there's not a lot that we have in Genesis prior to the fall, but one of the emphasis is that this is good. There's an intrinsic goodness in God's creation because God created it. And presumably when I say intrinsic, it's not that that's like a good apart from God, right? Because it's in him we live and move and have our being. God created creation to be in relation to himself in various ways. And this means that things like our bodies, things like our natures, things like our sexuality are good, first and foremost. But then the second error, which I imagine you could probably guess on here, is simply the opposite error. This error is going to be a failure to attend to how universal and significant the fall was and how devastating sin has been. Whereas, with the first error, you can see this in the Christian tradition. There's been a tendency to kind of demonize our bodies and sexuality. And that it's easy for us today to look at this and kind of shake our heads. This is not an unreasonable mistake. Again, I think it's still a mistake. Of the two, it's probably the right mistake. And in part, that's because, when we look at like Romans 6, for instance, or even the use of the word the flesh, right? Flesh does not mean bodies, although it can mean, the Greek word sarx can mean bodies. But Paul often uses it to talk about our depravity, which is why something like the NIV will often translate sarx as sin nature, sinful nature. The problem with that is Paul's purposely using an embodied image. He could have made up a word, he could have used other words. He chose specifically this kind of word that signifies embodiment to talk about sin. And in part because something like, again, Romans 6, because sin often takes up residence in our bodies to disorder the creature, to make us obey our passions. Right? That's one of the traditional ways to think about this. And so we need to recognize that it's going to be easy to overreact to the error that says, well, the flesh is just bodiment or something like that, and to overreact and say, no, it has nothing to do with that. Well, does it have nothing to do with that? I think that's going to be, we're going to have to talk about this, and there's mistakes we can make here. And the people who have overreacted to it have helped us, if I'm honest, right? They've helped us see like, oh, the tradition didn't do a good job with our sexuality, right? It kind of demonized our sexuality in unhelpful ways. They were no longer able to see the goodness of it. Or similarly, the tradition just didn't think well about our bodies. And let me just say, this gets to one of the biggest, I think the biggest tension that you find among conservative Christians and psychologists. Not to say that there's not overlap there. I mean, I'm at a university, Biola, that has a major psychoanalytic school of psychology on campus, right, where we're trying to do Christian psychotherapy. At Biola, if you don't know Biola, Biola stands for the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, right? Where we are like, how are we going to do this in a Bible-centric context? Well, one of the tensions I see among psychologists and among conservative Christians specifically is this very point, right? Because you're going to have to create a space between seeing something in you that's sinful and broken. Like, you're going to have to pause long enough to stand in relation to that aspect of yourself without judging it, to say, what's really happening here? Whereas conservatives have a tendency to not do that because it feels to them, and I use the language here, feels, for very purposefully, because this is, I think they're responding to this out of a feeling sense, like they're just feeling their way into these things, and it feels sinful. It feels like they're not taking sin seriously enough to pause. And so there's this refusal to really engage what's happening. Now, again, I think that's from a psychological point of view, that's a massive error, because what's going to happen is they're going to be very naive to what is really going on in their lives. And that's going to drive them. And it's going to subconsciously drive them. And they have no idea why it drives them. They're not even going to know why they make the decisions they make. And they're not going to get down to the deeper inclinations of the heart that are going to show them, why am I even turning to this sin to begin with? And so we have to come up with ways to think through that. I mean, that's, as I've, again, one of my responsibilities as someone who teaches spiritual formation is to provide the continuity thesis. So I'm going to start with discontinuity. And when I teach this, because I haven't really told you how I do this. So when I teach this, I do kind of go back and forth. So it's not like I just do, I don't know, the first 6 weeks of the semester, discontinuity, and then continuity or something like that. I don't do it that way. But I do often push the more continuity material later, because I want to show them, like, look, there's real continuity here. So when a psychologist talks about attachment, that simply is what, like, for instance, the Reformed tradition would often call communion. Like, they're the same kind of impulses going on here. But then I'm going to have to tweak it, because I'm going to have to say, because we started with discontinuity, we're going to have to look at all the things we can't take over from a psychological account, right? Where there's going to be a different telos here. There's going to be different ways to kind of engage it pastorally. But then I'm also going to ask the questions. But look, psychologists, like, there's real serious Bible-centric Christian psychologists wrestling through these things, and they're seeing these kinds of results. So how do we make sense of that, right? So there's going to have to be a real integration that goes on. That's going to be more than what I tend to think of as either kind of tacking these things on the side. That's going to be naive in the sense of taking a whole package from, like, the psychological world and just applying it into the Christian world. Like, I'm going to have to kind of rethink it theologically. I'm going to have to take it up into a theological structure that in many ways is going to kind of destroy it. If you think of how early Christians took kind of a broadly kind of Neoplatonic view of some things, and when they pulled that into a Trinitarian metaphysic and Trinitarian view of reality, it destroyed it. It was no longer kind of Neoplatonic. It became its own thing. That's exactly what we're going to have to do psychologically. But on the other side, there's going to be a danger of just ignoring all of that material in literature and pretending that nothing good can come out of Nazareth, as it were. And I'm going to say, no, there's Christians working in this field. The Spirit is at work. There's things we can learn here. We can't be naive about it. And again, the bulk of people I see working both in Christian psychology as well as in biblical counseling, not the extremes, mind you, but the bulk that are working in this area just recognize that that's obviously true. And so that's one of the ways this is going to kind of show up. But it's going to be important in terms of how we navigate those two errors I listed, right? So remember, the first error is going to be to forget that we were created good. The second error, and I see this among, I don't want to kind of name names here, but I will. No, I'm kidding. I see this, and I've done this in a different podcast, so I will name one name. And again, it's not to pick on him, because I actually think this is a deeply faithful person who's doing significant work. But, for those of you who know my work, Jamin Goggin and I, my dear friend Jamin, wrote a book, The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb. And we actually have a podcast, I'll put that in the notes, a different podcast aimed just at the question of Christian power. And so Christian power gets down to some of these things. And, when we started writing that book, we were looking around saying, no one talks about this stuff. And I think that's still true, although that is changing. It's been encouraging to see since we started writing. I mean, we started writing that book, wow, I want to say 15 years ago now. I mean, it's been a long time since we first started. And when we started, there was nothing. But then Andy Crouch wrote a book called Playing God. And then he followed that up with a book, From Strength to Weakness. And so Andy's been one of the people that have also talked about these things. And one of the things that kind of worried me after our book came out is people kept on reaching out to me saying, man, that was so helpful. It was great. Now I'm having my staff read your book alongside Andy's book to help them understand power, because I think these are the two books on the topic. And I was like, well, I'm honored and humbled that you think that's true. The problem is these two books are totally incompatible. And so did you read our book and did you read Andy's book? And so again, if you've read Andy's book, please read ours. And if you've read ours and haven't read Andy's, please read him. I mean, I think you need to sit with these. This is someone who is faithfully trying to give an account of these things. But as I see the school of thought that Andy's coming out of, which is, again, very similar to what Keller was coming out of, this is kind of what I often call kind of neo-Calvinism, sometimes a neo-Kuyperian context. They do a great job of emphasizing the first mistake, like correcting the first mistake. Like, this is the group that's going to say, look, creation is good. We need to engage creation. We need to engage culture. We need to not forget that it is like the human impulse to do good art, for instance, to make beautiful things isn't insignificant. And again, I really value these folks for that. I think that the error they tend to make, or at least the temptation that they're tempted by, is going to be the second one, is to misconstrue how devastating sin has been. And I think what ends up happening is there ends up being a real naivete to how the powers and principalities function. There tends to be a naivete to what it looks like to engage a culture. And the thought is that we're going to, Christians are going to do this. We're going to create culture, and we're going to create these institutions that do this, and we're going to influence culture. And there seems to be less insight into how culture's actually going to influence them. Again, that's a critique. I'm sure there's good responses to that. So this is something that, don't just take my word for it. Seek these folks out and engage them. But that's what I see going on. That's what worries me about not only the discussion about power, because I think in the power discussion, the more explicit passages about power, the more radical things said, like Galatians 2:20 or 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. That those aren't axiomatic. Like, to put that differently, I think on their view, the cross doesn't play a big enough role. And that's when you talk about beauty. When we talk about what we call a theological aesthetics, the cross is the kind of grand gestalt that shows us beauty is something totally different than we imagined. The cross always bears witness to a kind of beauty and a kind of harmony that is going to feel antithetical to nature. Now that gets us back to the nature grace discussion. You might have forgotten that that's what we're actually talking about. I didn't forget. It appears that I did. That I didn't. But let me show how this is related. Oftentimes, I think what happens is people say grace perfects nature. So you can give an account of nature and you can look at it like, what are we by nature? By nature, we are created as image bearers, for instance. By nature, we are created as psychological beings, right, with a rational mind and soul. That's both, things like understanding our mind and our willing, and therefore our affection. We can talk about our kind of sensual appetites. We can talk about our vegetative powers, to use the old language. There's all sorts of things we could talk about there. And then we could talk about how grace perfects those things. It doesn't destroy them. As Edwards has said, I've been doing a lot of work on this in Jonathan Edwards. He makes a great point where he says, look, if Christianity destroyed our self-love, so he's distinguishing their selfishness from self-love. He says, if Christianity destroyed our self-love, it would destroy our humanity. And then he just kind of bluntly says, and Christianity is not destructive of humanity. Grace perfects nature. My worry is when people say that, what they think, that they're actually conflating two things together. They're conflating what I've just said, the very fact that grace doesn't destroy humanity but perfects it. They're conflating that with something experiential. Whereas what I want to say is, it's not going to feel like it perfects it. It is going to feel like it destroys it. On an experiential level, it is going to feel discontinuous. And so that's where this is where the discontinuity thesis needs to come in and say, no. This is what's going to make it an entirely different kind of account than the kind of accounts you see in nature. This is where there's going to be a real prophetic edge to spiritual formation, and where you can't, merely, advance your Myers-Briggs or advance sociological instincts and move on. No, like a discontinuity thesis is going to, they're going to read those things, they're going to engage them, but they're going to engage them prophetically because they do not understand ultimately the truth of human flourishing. Because you can't understand human flourishing by nature precisely because we're image bearers. Notice that being made in the image of God, there's a methodological import to that doctrine. You flourish as you image another. That's what human flourishing requires of you. Every other account will be too kind of moored to our fallenness to recognize that's true. I mean, if you went to an atheist and said, look, you're not made to image yourself to the world. You're made to image another to this world. You're made to image actually God to the world. And that's actually where you become you. They're going to look at you like you're nuts. Like, what are you talking about? That sounds antithetical to your humanity. No, you haven't. They're going to think you're trapped and you're bound by something. That doesn't sound like freedom in our culture. No, our culture's cry of you be you is the opposite of that, right? And so we need to give an account of kind of supernatural formation, spiritual formation that names the discontinuity, that helps make sense of the continuity, and then shows where these errors might seep in. But when it comes to the fact that we tend to have an account of, and we see this all throughout the Christian tradition and all throughout the Protestant tradition, that actually what God is going to do in your life is going to surprise you. That the Christian growth is surprising because it will go against your expectations, and it will often feel like this is not working and this is not right because you've accepted too much continuity in your view, and God is going to purify that in all sorts of ways. And so, for instance, take what some in the tradition call the dark night of the soul. Both Catholics and Protestants will use that language. Protestants more often, usually because they didn't want to sound Catholic, they change the language but keep the theory. And the language they use is something like spiritual desertion, or to be deserted by God. Our God is a withdrawing God, William Gurnall writes, the Puritan spiritual writer. And so they're going to give a whole account of how God withdraws himself from us, withdraws communion to show us what is in our hearts. Well, notice here that that's not what we imagine going on. If you just give an account of continuity, you're going, wait, what? What's happening now? Why is this happening? I mean, William Perkins, you do not get stodgier than William Perkins. Like, if there's a stodgiest of stodgy in the Puritan tradition, Perkins has to be up for running as the king of the stodgiest of the Puritans. This is not provocative. This is the stodgiest folks, right? This is, something that most well-known fundamentalists today are writing the forewords for, right? So I'm not, just to kind of show you the brand of which we're working in. Like Perkins is going to say, yeah, sometimes God takes his presence from you so you fall into deeper sin. Okay, right? Notice that if you start with continuity, you're not going to be led there. And you're not going to be led there because you're going to go, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense according to kind of what formation is. That's not going to make sense according to, how we understand attachment and understand these things. So this is why, again, I'm going to read all that stuff. I teach attachment. I teach object relations theory. There's all sorts of schools of psychology that I integrate because I want my students to know, like, look, this stuff's out there and here's what they're arguing. Here's what I think they get right. Here's what I think they don't. And I'm going to talk theologically. Well, how do I think the New Testament talks about that? How do I think the Old Testament talks about these things? How do I think the fact that we have the Spirit within us changes how we think about human psychology? And so, again, that's the kind of work that this is going to lead us into, where a discontinuity thesis is going to show, look, there's going to be a series of temptations of naturalizing this thing. And that could look all sorts of ways, right? It could look purely psychological with the Spirit tacked on the end. One of the ways I see this showing up, sometimes it's more obvious by more charismatic folks. Sometimes it's not. Actually, sometimes I see the same thing going on with folks that arguably don't even have an account of the Spirit. But there ends up being a very kind of God and me set in contrast to one another that can't actually make sense of how the New Testament talks about this. Right? Because remember a passage like a passage we looked at when we talked about Pelagianism, Philippians 2:12 and 13, where we have God is working in us both to will and to work. Notice there, our willing, which is something we're free to do, right? We are willing agents. You don't have a will, so to speak, because that's talking about having, so that's going to overly mechanize the thing. You as a person will. You have desires and inclinations, and you have what the tradition would actually call motion, which is ultimately where we get our emotion language from. But the motions of the person, there's this freedom in our motions to incline towards things. Notice that God is at work in us so that we will freely. Right? Where the Spirit is, there's freedom. Notice how it's not going to be easy to talk about, well, am I willing or is God willing in me? The answer is going to be yes. Like the problem is a lot of us, sometimes it's it's actually a kind of humility instinct in us to say something like, oh, it's just not me, it's God. Well, okay. And there's times where we should say that, like there's something right there. But there's also something that's kind of a reaction. It's a kind of similar error being made when we forget that we were created good, and when we forget that God's given us real agency. No, we are called to will the good. We are called to will in the kingdom of God. We are called to obey from the heart. But it is God that's at work in us. And so we must not, you see, I think what's happened for these folks is they start with continuity, and they're kind of this self-enclosed agent, but then they have a really big view of God. And often, and one of the reasons I said this often shows up in charismatic accounts is because you often have a kind of bloated account of God's special activity and a diminishing account of God's what we used to call his common activity. And you can think about it as kind of his providential activity, his working in and through the contours of creaturely causation, we might say, to kind of, make that maybe overly technical. Basically, how God works in and through his creation, how he works in and through my freedom. My free will isn't set against God. God works freely in me to freely work, right? Like that. Those things aren't set in contrast. This is why most of the free will discussion is just absolutely bankrupt, because they don't have a God who's actually God. They have a God who's a huge creature whose causality is butting up against my causality. That's not who God is, and that's not what causation is in God's world. In him, we live and move and have our being. God works within us to will and to work freely, right? So that, notice now, by a discontinuity thesis, by starting with who God is and who his creatures are, that's just going to establish a different space to talk about things like spiritual formation. And so, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because, on a popular level, I think what's happened, and I'm going to talk about this more next time, but one of the things that's happened in spiritual formation is the center of gravity has shifted from the seminary and more academic folks to the more practical ministry-based folks. And again, I'm not against that. That's great in a lot of ways. I love popularizers. My father has given himself to a popularizing kind of work, and his ministry has been wildly profound. And popularizers have a unique genius to them. One of the things I think my father has done beautifully, and to be honest, I actually kind of stand in awe of the work he has done. And I have academics tell me this all the time. They're like, man, how he's not a scientist, right? Like, how does he? By the way, I'm sorry, I'm assuming most of you know. My father's Lee Strobel. He's done the Case series, Case for Christ, Case for Faith, and all these case books. And one of the things he does, I think, profoundly well, that is a unique kind of genius in my mind, is he doesn't have training in a lot of the stuff he's talking about, but he's interviewing these folks, he's learning their works, he's learning the technical language, and he's able to do something that only master teachers know how to do well, which is, how do I offer an approximation that is not a reduction? Like, how do I say something that is true but not reductive? And that's a hard thing to do. So popularizers do this well. The temptation of a popularizer, though, is reduction. And I think a lot of what is happening right now is there's a lot of folks who are starting with a continuity thesis that, because they don't have done enough theological education, perhaps, or even just done enough theologically on this area, because quite honestly, one of the things that's been missing from the spiritual formation conversation is theology. And this is something our program at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, we emphasize. Like, we do spiritual theology because we thought that that's the missing piece of all of that. That's what isn't going on. You have people pragmatically talking about spiritual disciplines and growth and these things, and they're assuming a continuity thesis. And again, that's why it's like, well, isn't this just Pelagianism? Like, at the end of the day, if you just tack the Spirit on the end, we have a Pelagian methodology. And so we need an account that has a real theological heft to it, because we have to begin with discontinuity, but then we have to also do quite a lot of continuity material, and that's what the other side isn't doing. Right? Like, this is where, particularly on the kind of more fundamentalist side of things, that are often just reductively reading the Puritans and not even reading them well. They're just reducing them down, but also they're not ever giving themselves to do the work the Puritans did. One of the things that animates me is I want to do the work they did. I don't want to just repeat them. I think if Edwards came back to life today, if, I don't know, the Lord decided I'm going to reanimate Edwards or whatever, and something I'm not assuming he's going to do, Edwards would be horrified that we're still using the religious affections. And the religious affections is a profound work. I love that work. I can post to, I've written a whole kind of introductory piece to it. It is one of the kind of, if you want a master class of Christian discernment, the religious affections is one of those texts. If Edwards would come back to life today and he'd see, like, I wrote that work in the 1750s. You haven't learned more about human psychology since then? He would be horrified. He would be so offended that we never did the work he did. But on the fundamentalist side, that's what happens, is they don't actually ever pick up the work that these folks did. They reductively quote them, take these quotes, and they kind of link them together in an overly reductive package, and they never actually do the work. And so that's going to be a real temptation. And so when we look at what's going on today, you know, one of the things we have to do is we have to look at the errors we can make. How do we not reduce the goodness of creation? How do we not reduce the significance of the fall? How do we balance the goodness of our bodies and sexuality with the brokenness and the sinfulness of our bodies and sexuality? How do we do this when it comes to nature and the supernatural? How do we do this when we have a God who it doesn't butt up against us, because God isn't a huge creature? He doesn't take up space like I take up space. Like I never run into God anywhere. Like, whoa, is God there? You know, that's not the kind of being God is, as it were. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with saying the kind of being, but I'm going to leave that aside now, because God is God. God is only comparable to himself in a very real sense. And so when we think about spiritual formation, we need to start with who God is and what God does. And then we need to remember, but creation was good. And whatever else the fall did, it didn't entirely eradicate that. That's not what total depravity means. Total depravity is the universal brokenness of the world, the universal rebellion of the world. Not you are as broken and depraved as you can be. That's not what it wasn't an eradication of the goodness of creation. And that's going to play out in spiritual formation in all sorts of ways. And so, you know, with the kind of account where the person is bypassed, you know, it isn't me, it's God. Again, I said I see that with certain charismatic accounts. I grew up with that. You know, I remember growing up at Willow Creek Community Church. I would hear, you know, I remember as a kid, if I showed up sometimes I wouldn't go to the youth ministry stuff. I just go to church. And I remember Bill Hybels often would say something like, you know, the best thing someone could tell me is that when you were on stage, you just disappeared and it was God there. And I want to say, wow, that is dangerous. No, that isn't good. God does not have to annihilate his creation to be present to it. Right? This is one of the reasons why Protestants tend to have a different account of Eucharist than Catholics do. Because God doesn't have to eradicate his creation to be present to it. God doesn't have to eradicate the wineness and the breadness of wine and bread to be present there. You don't need to disappear. God works in you and through you, and you are called to image God, not in a way that you disappear or are annihilated. But of course, again, there's going to be all sorts of ways that I think, again, this is what I worry about the Neo-Kuyperians, where suddenly what it means to image God is just, it ends up being, in my mind, again, I don't want this to sound flippant, but I worry it has a bougie instinct to it, where it's just like, as long as I make artisan coffee for the glory of God, it must be for the glory of God. Right? As long as my art is just highest level art according to the art community, then it brings God glory. Like just doing things really well. You know, this is why I think in the last 30 years, this group has gotten so much attention. Because there's been a group of people that have just like, look, I don't want our churches to look cheesy. Like I really want them to be kind of cutting edge, right? I want to have the best coffee. I want to have, you know, rich mahogany, and I want to, you know, whatever it is. You can tell I'm not in this world. I don't even know what is cool anymore. But this is also why you have among other groups, right? These kind of celebrity types wearing $2,000 sneakers. Like this is, you know, that crowd. I just want to say, you know, you'd be better served wearing, you know, camel's fur and a leather belt around your waist. Quite honestly, you'd be better served going to a thrift shop than wearing $2,000 sneakers at a church, according to the kingdom of God. And so again, there's overreactions in these things. There's all sorts of things we can and should say instead there. But I worry that we don't often take seriously discontinuity, which leads us into worldliness, and it leads us to be naive about the powers and the principalities and how they work. And that shows up with money, with what we used to call mammon. That shows up with what I like to talk about, and this is certainly not simply me, but like the economics of communities, right? What kind of economies do we trade in? And that often means at a lot of these places that end up valuing kind of quality, we end up telling the very people Scripture says we should pay attention to, the poor, the maligned, people who have disabilities. We end up telling them explicitly or implicitly they have no role here. They have no significance here. We end up telling the church that our power is found in strength and not weakness, in other words. And so this is not an insignificant issue. It touches everything. And so as always with this podcast, my hope is that this is an invitation to drawing near. How might the Lord be calling you to draw near? And maybe it is kind of presenting your body as a living sacrifice. And the way to do that for the renewal of your mind is to present your view, your articulation, your understanding of spiritual formation, and to just place that before the Lord and say, Lord, I don't know. Maybe I've made these mistakes. Lord, have I led people too much into discontinuity, that we demonize everything else, and that there's good Christians who we've maligned and just not bothered taking their thoughts seriously, who are working hard at, like, let's say, in the field of psychology? Or on the other side, maybe you say, maybe I'm a Christian psychologist, and maybe I just haven't taken seriously enough how discontinuity has a prophetic edge against my guilt, and maybe I need to hold these things open a little more before the Lord. Don't just think about these things. Talk to the Lord about these things. Draw near to Him and wrestle with Him on your calling to be faithful to the way of Jesus and to walk in the Spirit, so that we can remember we are created good. And yet the fall has been devastating. And we must have accounts not only of sin, but of brokenness and the shattering of God's creation, so that we can faithfully articulate what it means to image bear in this present evil age.
This has been Spiritual Formation, an invitation to drawing near. As always, your support is such an encouragement. Please subscribe and rate this podcast. And if this episode was helpful for you, subscribe to my newsletter at kylestrobel.substack.com.